recording, and then we're going to, okay.
There we go.
Well, welcome to the first presentation of our Historic Speakers Series. Like I said, this is a joint project between Smoky Valley Historical Association and the Lindsborg Old Mill and Swedish Heritage Museum with a grant from Humanities Kansas. If you don't know who I am Lenora Lynham. I am now the former director of the Lindsborg Old Mill. We just hired a new director on August 1, and that is Aubrey Wheeler, and she has just jumped in with both feet and is forging straight ahead. So I will be staying on. Exactly how long I will be staying on full time is still kind of up in the air, but I'm hoping to stay on full time, maybe perhaps through the end of the year, and then be cutting back to part time here in the near future. So our presentation today is Bruce Karstadt, and he will be talking about his grandmother, Albertha Sundstrom. So just a few housekeeping notes, please mute yourself and so that Bruce is not interrupted while he's talking. As soon as Bruce finishes his presentation, we will end the recording and then we will open it up for questions and answers after that. So I will turn it over to you, Bruce.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Lenora. And so good to see so many of you have already had a few pleasant exchanges while we were waiting to get started. I'm really honored to have been asked to make this presentation about my maternal grandmother, Albertha Christine Nelson Sundstrom. I'm hoping that you can see the slide show. That's showing. Okay, great. And you can hear me well enough. Apologize in advance if I happen to have a cough every now and then. But I think I can get through this in about 35 minutes. I have about 40 slides to show. And I'm just going to dive in right away. Of course, this is about my grandmother, Albertha. The photo on the left is, well, the one on the right is her Messiah Church photo from the last yearbook or annual report or the directory that they published. But on the left, this is her standing in her very small kitchen, dishing up a bowl of dapagritan, the meat broth that we always had and which many other families had at Christmas time. Ours was served at Christmas Eve noon, along with some relish, and then my grandmother's Swedish rye bread. And I think she's probably got a pot of Swedish egg coffee there right below her hand, holding the bowl. You can find both of those recipes in Measure for Pleasure, by the way. This is my grandmother's family. Albertha was born on February 1st, 1901, on a farm near Smolin, Kansas. She was one of three daughters, born to George on the left and Tensa on the right, Tensa Nelson on the right. My grandmother is the older of the two, and this is her younger sister, Verna, who died, unfortunately, at the age of 12 in 1916. Her father, George, was born in 1875 near Smolin. He was one of 13 children, born to Edward and Johanna Nelson, and as a youth, he moved with his parents and siblings to Tonkawa, Oklahoma, along with some other Smoky Valley families. The venture, whatever it was, and I don't know much about it, did not prove successful, and most of the families returned. Albertha's mother, full name, Potentia Christine Peterson, was known as Tensa. She was a Swedish immigrant. She emigrated with her family from southern Sweden, from Halmstad, Sweden, at a very early age. And the two probably met, most likely, given the geographic location of where their families settled, probably met at Salemsburg Lutheran Church. I'm going to pause to look at Albertha's great grandparents. Anders Ludwig Peterson and Carolina Peterson had a daughter, Johanna, who was the mother of my grandmother's father. Anders Ludwig was a very curious looking man, quite superstitious, had kind of a troll-like image, it seems like to me. He and Carolina had a farm about a mile west of Salemsburg, but moved into Lindsborg later in life. Um, Edward Nelson and Johanna Peterson Nelson were the parents of my grandmother's father. Um, uh, they, um, they, as I mentioned, this family lived for a while in Tonkawa, Oklahoma, but came back to the Smoky Valley. They had 13 children, one of whom died at a very early age, but 12 grew into adulthood. The family lived for a while on a farm east of Lindsborg. It was called Rustad, and it was for a while also the home of the home of Dr. Holderda. Um, these surviving 12 children, by the time the youngest was born, the oldest had already left. And so the family was united together as a family only one time. And this is a photograph of that occasion. My grandmother's father is the second from the right in the back row. Um, um, Tensa and George married on May 9th, 1900. And after the birth of Albertha, my grandmother, I'm going to probably like flip back and forth. I'm never going to remain consistent. Uh, After the birth of my grandmother in February 1901, they moved to Western Kansas, where they lived in this sod house, which was located 16 miles west of Ellis. Their mode of transportation was a horse and wagon. George worked with other relatives for a few years in some kind of construction and typically was gone from Monday through Friday. And so Tensa and the children were left at home in his absence. They worshiped in a Lutheran church near Ogalla, Kansas. And here you see Tensa, Verna, Albertha, and George and two pooches. In an oral interview, my grandmother talked about the difficulty of travel at any time in Western Kansas by wagon and horse, but particularly in winter. Once she remembered they were in a blizzard that was so severe, she said chickens froze to death. Um, on those kinds of excursions in winter, they often put heated bricks in their wagon to keep them warm. They even furnished the children some whiskey as well. And she recalled another trip in a bad storm where they took shelter in a rural school building. Apparently, in those days, those schools were kept unlocked just in case somebody needed them as a shelter for whatever reason. They left Western Kansas for Lindsborg so that their daughters could gain an education in Lindsborg. Albertha was in the second grade when she came to Lindsborg. George, who was there on the left behind the counter, he enrolled in the Bethany Academy and graduated in 1911 with a 2-year degree in business. And here he's working as a clerk for the Hagstrom Brothers manufacturing company in Lindsborg. This is a photo, the only photo that I have of the family, which includes all 3 daughters. And this is taken, of course, in Lindsborg. Here you have from left to right, George, my grandmother, Evelyn, the youngest, Tensa, and then Verna, who I mentioned earlier, passed away at the age of 12. The youngest daughter, Evelyn, married Cy Westman, in case that rings a bell for any of you. George was an extremely well-respected man in Lindsborg. He left work at Hagstrom Brothers to be the senior clerk at the post office. They were founding members of Messiah Lutheran Church. George was a member of the Masonic Lodge. And as I'm told by my grandmother, he was frequently sought out by others in the community for advice. He was a very common sense, good thinking person. He unfortunately died at a very young age, at the age of 54, in December of 1922. This is the graduation photo from 8th grade of my grandmother and her classmates. She's seated front row, a third from the left. This was taken in 1916. And here's a copy of the cover of the graduation program. And this is the school in which she likely attended grade school after they moved back to Lindsborg. I don't recall my own 8th grade graduation ceremonies very well, but this 1916 ceremony seems quite elaborate with lots of music, readings. They had a class vision, and my grandmother sang a vocal duet with a classmate, Wilnette Nelson, entitled "Listen, 'Tis the Woodbird's Song." My grandmother was a lovely young woman. During her high school years, she was a good student. She was active in many extracurricular activities, particularly vocal music. She told me once that she was the girls' tennis champion for McPherson County, but I have been unable to verify that through my own research. During her public school years, she fell in love with Carl Sundstrom. Here on the right in front of that old jalopy with my grandmother in the back seat smiling. Carl lived with his family just 2 houses south of my grandmother's family home on South 3rd Street. At the left is Carl's family. His parents were John and Christine Sundstrom. They were cousins of the J.O. Sundstrom family that operated the big mercantile store on North Main. He had 2 older sisters. Louise is seated to the left. She married George Edwardson, and they've built a life in Galveston, Texas. They had 2 children, Dr. John Edwardson and Charlotte, who married Irwin Danielson, and that may be familiar to you as well. And then the other older sister, standing with her arm resting on her father's shoulder, is Ani, who married Cecil Palmquist, and they had a farm just southwest of Lindsborg. John Sundstrom was a mason, and he also worked for his cousin's store, the J.O. Sundstrom department store. I have many photos of my grandmother and Carl and lots of other Lindsborg youth enjoying life in Lindsborg and the Smoky Valley. Many of them involved around picnics and excursions to Coronado Heights, often near the water tanks at the base of the hill on the west side, or over to the old mill. And these are some examples. There's a group seated on a log on the far left. Carl is the one in the front of the log, and my grandmother has her arm wrapped tightly around his waist. In an oral interview, my grandmother said that one of the more important social activities during her high school years was Saturday night movies. She remembered an outdoor theater in an empty lot on North Main Street where the bank now stands. It was kind of a walk-in theater which charged 5 cents, and they showed silent movies as well as newsreels like Perils of Pauline. I think despite the absence of radio and television and all the things that we have today, these young people built a very fascinating and active social life at that time. After her graduation from Lindsborg High School in 1920, she was 19 years old. She'd also earned a teaching certificate that allowed her to teach in public schools. So she started her career at Trains School, about 3 miles east of Lindsborg in 1920. She was barely older than her students, but she told me that she had already developed an understanding of how to maintain discipline, which if any of you had her in the 5th grade, you probably had some examples of that, and you can attest to that. While teaching at Trains School, she took classes at Bethany to gain an additional certificate to teach music. So from 1919 to 1922, I have her transcript. She earned about 60 hours of credit at Bethany College in voice, in piano, in ear training, harmony, organ, and conducting. And she finally, in August of 1922, got a special teacher's certificate. And with that, and with this very supportive letter of recommendation from then President Dr. Ernst Peelblad, she managed to secure a job teaching in Minneapolis, Kansas. So she went out to Minneapolis in the fall of 1922 as the next step in her teaching career. And while in Minneapolis, she was also the choir director at the local Baptist church. During her high school years, her year teaching at Trains, and then also her time in Minneapolis, she continued to be courted by Carl Sundstrom. And this is their wedding photo. They finally married on August 24th, 1923. And it was an elopement. The ceremony was in a Lutheran parsonage in Newton, Kansas. And there's no mention of, and I don't have any records of the ceremony and who was there or anything like that. But they married August 24, 1923. My understanding of their early married life is a little bit murky. I know that she resigned her Minneapolis teaching career to live with Carl in Lindsborg after their marriage. In an oral interview, my grandmother said that after getting married, she taught at Bridgeport and at Assyria for a time, at least up until my mother was born in 1928. Carl was a salesman. He worked for a time in a local clothing store. And for a while, both my grandmother and Carl managed an A&P grocery store in Lindsborg, but the parent company closed the store in 1930s because of low profit. Photo on the left shows Lindsborg Main Street in the 20s. Hopefully I have that accurately. And on the right, this may be from their days managing the grocery store. My grandmother did say that Carl was a really fine salesman, and she claimed that he once sold a combine to a farmer during a dust storm. On May 23rd, 1928, my mother, Patty Sundstrom, was born. You see her on the left in between my grandmother and Carl. This was 5 years after their marriage. They then continued to live in Lindsborg. Carl worked as a salesman, but I really don't have any details at all about his employment other than his stint at the clothing store and the grocery store. My grandmother did say once that the financial hardships of the Depression years was one of the reasons that they had only one child. My grandfather Carl died in July 1951 at the age of 49 years. I was born a few months later in November. And I was struck by this morning as I was thinking about, that my grandmother had some real tragedy in her life. Her father died at 54. Her husband died at 49. She had a sister who died at age 12. She had two nephews, Terry Westman and Willis Keith Palmquist, who both also died at the ages of 11 and 12. So there was a lot of joy in her life, but also a lot of tragedy, I think, that the family needed to come together and cope with. There was a shortage of teachers during World War II, and so she was asked by McPherson County to return to teaching as they needed an elementary teacher in Marquette. So she agreed, and she was issued a provisional teaching certificate with the requirement that she return to college to get a bachelor's in elementary education. After teaching in Marquette, she also taught at Elving School for 3 years in the early 1950s. This is one of her classes. And Elving, as you know, is just a little less than a mile northeast of Lindsborg. The card illustration on the left is the only image that I have of Elving School. Lenora kindly provided me with some annual reports from Elving School, and I'm showing two of them here. The report for 1953 on the left and the report for 1954 on the right. Her salary in 1954 was $2,760. That was 8 months or 157 class days. Enrollment fluctuated during her time at Elving between 11 and 15 students. And what I found interesting in these reports is that up until 1954, Elving, and I imagine all other public schools in Kansas, was required to report separately on enrollment of white students and colored students. This was discontinued in 1954, which of course was issued after the Brown versus the Board of Education decision desegregating schools. I mentioned that my grandmother was required to, earn a bachelor's in order to continue teaching, and they gave her a generous amount of time. So over 9 years, she took those classes. Mostly they were in summer. And she finally received her bachelor's degree from Bethany College on September 6th, 1956, at the age of 55, which I think was a very glorious day for her. For much of her career, after graduation, she taught fifth grade in Lindsborg in these three buildings, the grade school upper right, high school and middle school left, and then the lower right, Sundstrom School, which opened in 1962. This is one of her fifth grade classes in Lindsborg. This would be the Lindsborg High School class of 1968. I can tell because I see Warren Olson in here, David Larson, one of the Mattingly twins as well. I'm not sure why there's a poster board or bulletin board in the back that has a lot of information about Davis Coffee House, which was a focus of the recent Smoky Valley Historical Society newsletter. Maybe that was a local history lesson. I'm not really quite sure. But teachers had to have bulletin boards. My grandmother was required to retire from the Lindsborg system at the age of 65 in 1966. And they were pretty inflexible about that, despite her request to continue to teach 2 more years because she needed 2 more to qualify for a larger pension. But that wasn't to be in Lindsborg. So she found a job teaching at the elementary school at the Schilling Air Force Base. But that lasted only 1 year because they closed the base. And so then to get her 25th year, she secured a job in gypsum. That gave her a full pension, and she retired in 1968. I'm going to move now to my grandmother's avocational interests, chief among them being her devotion to singing in the Messiah Festival Chorus. She started to sing at the age of 16 when performances were at Lang Auditorium, and she eventually took part in the choir for 64 years. For her, singing Messiah and Bach was an act of religious devotion. It was really a form of worship for her. But she also had some funny stories about it, and I'll tell you one that was told to her by Dr. Hagbard Brasi, who was the Oratorio Society's director in the early 1900s. The choir, the chorus went to Oklahoma to sing 3 performances in Oklahoma City, and this is the chorus that went to Oklahoma City. And somewhere in there is my grandmother. When they were rehearsing, the French horns were out of tune. And there were 3 horn players, 2 of whom were students studying brass at Bethany, and one was an amateur. They guessed that it must be the amateur who was out of tune, so they decided to hide this guy's French horn before the performance. However, it backfired because during the performance, one of the remaining horn players was still out of tune. They picked the wrong guy. That's kind of I mean, since I played French horn in school, that's kind of an interesting story for me. In this article from 1984, she is quoted as saying, when we get to "Worthy is the Lamb" and the Amen chorus, we look at one another and we are crying almost every year. It just gets under your skin. It's a religious experience. She was a soprano. She was often seated next to Amy Anderson. And here this year on her right is Elsie Dorff. My grandmother was generally one of those in the chorus who was often sought out by reporters for quotes and thoughts about singing in the Messiah. Sometimes it was newspapers like here, the Salina Journal, or the nationally televised broadcast of the Messiah on public television and CBS. So this was a very meaningful thing for her and one of the most important things in her life, I think, along with her family. Another passion, sewing. a seamstress in making Swedish folk costumes. She learned how to sew from C.A. Berggren, a local tailor in Lindsborg, and over the course of many years, she sewed well over 200 costumes for all manner of people, including the president of the college, Peter Risteman. On the right is a photo of her with the daughter of Dr. John and Mrs. John Riggs, local dentist and mayor, and that was her 103rd costume. When my grandmother became incapacitated by a stroke and moved out of her house, we never did find a record or a logbook of her customers. There could have been one, but it escaped us, and I'm so sorry for that. It would have been nice to know more fully, but she often stated that she sewed over 200 costumes, and I believe that. She also made other clothing for customers, including wedding dresses, suits, gowns, etc. She loved to do it. She wanted to be helpful to people and also to keep busy. But I can say that she never charged enough for her work. Louise Emke shared with me that my grandmother charged her only $22 for making her wedding dress, but Perry gave her 40, which was something that gave her a great deal of delight. This is the book of Swedish folk costumes that my grandmother owned. And to tell you a little bit about the process, when someone came to her for a costume, she would review this book with them and ask them to pick a costume that they wanted. Sometimes the choice was based upon the person's specific heritage and knowledge of the region where their ancestors came from, but just as equally, people just picked a costume that was aesthetically pleasing to them. After the choice was made, my grandmother would take their measurements. She would cut out old newspapers to create a pattern, and then she would calculate how much material would be needed for the different articles of clothing. She would then require the customer to go out and purchase the cloth that they wanted, including buttons and that kind of thing. And when they brought it back, she would then go ahead and create the full costume for her. And I'm not sure that she ever really had an unhappy customer in this business. On the left, the man standing on the far left is wearing the costume that she patterned my costume after. And this is a photo of the full costume that she made for me. And I think this was done in 1979. And this, of course, is a page of the catalog that's been created by Lisa Larson and Marla Elmquist for presentation at Hyllningsfest and other times, I guess, of the full costume tradition in Lindsborg. I think they're doing important work, and I hope that these costumes and this work can continue. I should say that there's a slight inaccuracy here, which is my fault. This is not a costume from Västergötland, but rather it's one from Hälsingland. And here's some images of my grandmother and family in costumes over the years. In the center, of course, it's me and my family. I had a hard time smiling at that time, and I'm not sure why Barb has her hands on her waist. Something caught her attention, I guess. I want to say that my mother was an only child. So our family received a lot of loving attention from my grandmother. She adored my father. She supported my mother in her own teaching career, and she was always available to her grandchildren. And this is a rather touching photo that I found. My grandmother had a devastating stroke and spent the last few years of her life being cared for by the good people at the Bethany home. And while there, she was visited by this woman, Ulla Centegran, who made a visit to Lindsborg. Ulla Centegran was a well-known folk costume specialist and textile historian in Sweden, and you can see one of the books that she has created on the left. Someone must have told her about the elderly woman at the Bethany home who had made folk costumes, and so Ulla paid her a visit. And this was either in 1989 or 1991. I'm not sure which. My grandmother wasn't able to communicate due to her stroke, but I do hope that she understood something about Ulla and the respect that I think she was paying to my grandmother for her work. Wrapping up here with a few other interests. Messiah Lutheran Church was was a deep love of my grandmother. She was nearly a lifetime member. Um, uh, she was a member of the choir, Sunday school superintendent. She had a vacation Bible school. She was president of the Women's Society, on the church council. Her parents were founding members. And I found a copy of a talk that she gave once among her papers on the topic, quote, "Why I Am a Lutheran!" exclamation mark, end of quote. And in that talk, she expounds a lot about her faith and Martin Luther's teachings. And she concluded her talk in this way. And these are her words. "So I am a Lutheran. I am a member of a great church. I am an heir of a marvelous tradition. Here in this church, I was baptized, confirmed, married. My child and grandchildren have been baptized, confirmed, and married here, and many of my loved ones have been laid to rest from. And it is from this church, which in my turn, I hope to be laid to rest. I thank God for my Lutheran church." She was also active in Eastern Star, the Felicity chapter in Lindsborg, for more than 50 years. And this is her on the back row. I got her circled in a crude box, second from the right. My mom and Albertha's mother, Potenza, were also members. My mom is second from left, standing in the front row next to Glenn Maiden. And you see a lot of familiar faces from Lindsborg in this view. And this was also something very important to my grandmother. She was named as an attendant to the Queen's Court for Svensk Hyllningsfest on 2 occasions. The photo on the left is the 1973 court with Mrs. Helga Oberholzer as the Queen, Mrs. Linus Bengtsson as the other attendant. My grandmother was also an attendant in 1977 when Esther Bergin was named Queen. The photo on the right is of my mother, as you can see here, herding children in getting ready to be on stage for a Hyllningsfest. I'd like to say that my grandmother, who sewed hundreds of costumes for people, and my mother, who taught folk dancing to hundreds, were really among those many in Lindsborg who were at the heart of Lindsborg's biennial celebration of its heritage. And so I have to say, it's no wonder that I ended up at the American Swedish Institute. One other special story told by my grandmother to me, and it relates to this building, Lang Auditorium, which was built in 1895, primarily for performances of Handel's oratorio, the Messiah, although it was also a gymnasium, and it was named for a Swedish gymnast by the name of Henry Ling. It seated 4,000 people, plus a 600-voice choir and orchestra, and was always filled to standing room only capacity for those performances. Sadly, it burned to the ground in 1946. And this is, of course, where my grandmother first sang in the Messiah. It's also the scene of other performances. And please take note of these windows that are at the upper reaches of the auditorium, because it figures into the story that I'm going to tell you next. For my grandmother, the Messiah was a very big thing in her life, and perhaps the biggest thing other than her family. And this extended to the important soloists that often performed during the week framed by Palm Sunday and Easter Sunday, which Lindsborgians refer to as Messiah Week. One of those was Amelita Gallikurci, who sang in Lindsborg in 1918. My grandmother went to this concert with her father, and she has a very clear memory of it. Gallikurci was a tiny person, and she was wearing a red-orange dress. She had dark black hair. Her husband played the flute, and one of the pieces that she performed was the bell song from the opera Lakme. And my grandmother states that when she hit the high note, a beam of light shone on her through one of the little windows near the balcony. My grandmother described it as though it was like a spotlight had suddenly turned on and beamed down on Gallikurci as she held that high note. It was a breathtaking moment, according to my grandmother. The audience gasped, and it left a very vivid memory in her for her. Some final views of my grandmother. In the center, the three women most important in her life. My mom, Patty, her daughter, her sister, Evelyn, and her mother, Tensa, on the right. On the left, it's my grandmother performing in some kind of musical review. I don't really quite know. I have other pictures of other people, I think, performing in this same sort of concert. There used to be fall bazaars that were sponsored for many years by the college. I don't know if this was a part of it, but she loved to perform and she loved to sing. On the right, well, she really didn't travel much. She never had a yearning to go to Sweden, even though she had a cousin in Halmstad with whom she corresponded frequently. She did make it to the Grand Canyon, to New York City, Washington, D.C., and I just love this photo with these shades and the flash camera dangling from her neck. The quote is from a talk that my grandmother gave to some group in Lindsborg, and I found this handwritten text among her things. I think that she lived a rather remarkable life, nearly spanning the entire 20th century. She saw and was affected by many changes in society. She was resilient in overcoming personal adversity and family tragedy, but she was sustained by a deep faith, by a remarkable community, and a loving family. I'd like to thank the Old Mill for the invitation to talk about her. I am particularly grateful that Dr. Elston Floor, a retired Bethany College faculty member, and Ruth Baglian, then a Bethany College student, had conducted interviews with her later in her life. I drew a lot from those interviews, as well as from my own conversations with her, my mom, and other members of our family. So that is the end of my presentation. And I'm ready to take questions as soon as I figure out how to turn this